Have you ever wondered why the people who would make the best leaders never seem to run for office? Why genuinely wise, thoughtful individuals avoid positions of power, while narcissists and demagogues fight tooth and nail to get there? It's a pattern so consistent throughout history that it feels like a law of nature. Think of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor who never wanted the throne, versus Caligula, who craved it obsessively. Or in modern times, contrast someone like Carl Sagan, who educated millions but never sought political power, with the countless politicians who promise everything while understanding nothing. There's a reason for this pattern, and it's far more sinister than simple coincidence. 24 centuries ago, the Greek philosopher Plato identified exactly why this happens. He understood something we've spent millennia trying to ignore, that the qualities which make someone good at gaining power are almost perfectly opposite to the qualities that make someone good at using it. The ambitious climb while the wise withdraw. The narcissist campaigns while the thoughtful person hesitates. This creates a selection filter that systematically excludes the people we need most. And understanding why this happens might be the key to fixing our broken systems of leadership. Plato didn't arrive at these conclusions through abstract theorizing. He lived through one of the most chaotic periods in Athenian history, watching democracy tear itself apart from the inside. He witnessed demagogues manipulating crowds with emotional rhetoric. He saw his teacher Socrates, the wisest man in Athens, executed by a democratic mob that had been convinced by persuasive lies. He watched the 30 tyrants brutally suppress the city he loved. These weren't just political events for Plato. They were personal tragedies that shaped his entire philosophy. Out of this trauma came his masterwork, The Republic, where he asked the fundamental question, what would a truly just society look like? His answer was revolutionary and deeply unsettling. He argued that the best rulers would be philosopher kings, not politicians, not generals, not wealthy aristocrats, but people who had spent decades studying truth, justice, and wisdom. People who understood the difference between appearance and reality. People who had trained their minds to see past the illusions that captivate ordinary people. But here's where Plato's insight becomes truly radical, and here's the part that almost everyone misses when they read him. Plato didn't just say that philosophers should rule. He said that philosophers wouldn't want to rule, they would have to be compelled to do it, forced into leadership against their will. Because anyone who actually wants power, who campaigns for it, who fights for it, is automatically disqualified from deserving it. This wasn't a throwaway observation. This was Plato identifying a fundamental paradox built into human nature itself. The desire for power, he argued, comes from the wrong part of the soul. It comes from appetite, from ego, from the need to dominate and control. True wisdom, by contrast, comes from reason, from the ability to see things as they really are. And once you've developed that ability, once you've genuinely understood how complex reality is and how limited your own knowledge remains, the last thing you want to do is rule over others. Think about what this means. The very process of becoming wise makes you less likely to seek power. Meanwhile, the process of seeking power requires you to cultivate qualities that are antithetical to wisdom. This creates a selection mechanism that filters out the best candidates and elevates the worst. Plato divided the soul into 3 parts in his philosophy, and understanding this division is crucial to grasping why power corrupts the selection process. At the bottom is appetite, the part that craves food, pleasure, wealth, and status. In the middle is spirit, the part that seeks honor, recognition, and victory over others. At the top is reason, the part capable of understanding truth and justice. In a well-ordered soul, reason rules over spirit and spirit rules over appetite. But the pursuit of power, Plato argued, inflames the lower parts of the soul. It feeds appetite with promises of wealth and luxury. It feeds spirit with visions of glory and dominance. The more you pursue power, the more these lower elements grow stronger, drowning out reason. This is why Plato believed that by the time someone has successfully climbed to the top of a power structure, their soul is almost inevitably corrupted. The very climb has deformed them. They've had to make compromises, feed their ego, suppress their doubts, and develop habits of manipulation. Even if they started with good intentions, the process itself has changed them. Meanwhile, the person who has spent years training their reason, who has learned to control appetite and spirit, that person looks at the whole game of power politics and feels revulsion. They see it for what it is, a theatre of shadows driven by the lowest parts of human nature. To understand why this happens, we need to look at what it actually takes to gain power in any system, whether ancient Athens or modern democracies. You need overwhelming ambition, the kind that makes you willing to sacrifice everything else in pursuit of influence. You need comfort with self-promotion, the ability to constantly tell people how great you are without feeling ridiculous. You need to simplify complex issues into slogans and sound bites that fit on bumper stickers. You need supreme confidence, often overconfidence, that allows you to make sweeping promises without hesitation. You need thick skin and the willingness to attack opponents personally when necessary. You need to be comfortable making promises you may not be able to keep. These are the traits we systematically select for in democratic elections, in corporate ladder climbing, in any competitive power structure. But now consider what it takes to use power wisely once you have it. You need humility to recognize the vast areas of your own ignorance. You need caution because your decisions will affect millions of lives. You need complexity of thought to understand problems that don't have simple solutions. You need wisdom to prioritize long-term consequences over short-term popularity. You need empathy to genuinely consider perspectives vastly different from your own. You need intellectual honesty to admit when you're wrong and change course. Notice something crucial about these two lists? They're almost perfectly inverted. The personality traits that help you win power directly contradict the traits that help you wield power responsibly. It's like selecting Olympic swimmers based on their ability to play chess. The selection mechanism and the job requirements have almost nothing to do with each other. Plato illustrated this paradox with his famous Allegory of the Cave, and understanding this allegory is essential to grasping why good people make terrible leaders, or more accurately, why they never become leaders in the first place. Imagine prisoners chained in a cave since birth. They're facing a wall, watching shadows cast by a fire behind them. These shadows are the only reality they've ever known. They develop complex theories about the shadows. They become experts at predicting shadow patterns. Their entire intellectual life revolves around shadow analysis. Now imagine one prisoner breaks free and climbs out of the cave into the sunlight. At first, the light is overwhelming, painful even. His eyes need time to adjust. Gradually he begins to see the real world. Actual trees, not shadow trees, the sun itself, not firelight. Real depth and colour and complexity. He experiences a complete transformation in understanding. Everything he thought he knew was merely shadow play. Now here's Plato's devastating question. What happens if this enlightened person goes back down into the cave to free the other prisoners? First, his eyes haven't readjusted to the darkness, so he stumbles and appears clumsy. The prisoners who never left think he's become stupid. Second, he tries to tell them about a world they've never seen. He talks about the sun, about real objects, about how their entire reality is just shadows on a wall. They think he's insane. Third, he can no longer compete in their shadow prediction games because he knows the shadows don't matter. His knowledge makes him worse at the things the cave dwellers value. Finally, if he persists in trying to free them, if he keeps insisting their reality is false, they might kill him, just as Athens killed Socrates. This is Plato's metaphor for what happens when wise people try to lead the unwise. The very knowledge that qualifies them for leadership makes them ineffective at gaining it. They've seen too much. They understand too much complexity. They can't speak the language of simple certainties that moves crowds. This explains why philosophers would never voluntarily enter politics. They've climbed out of the cave. They've seen the sunlight of real knowledge. Why would they voluntarily descend back into the darkness to argue about shadows? Meanwhile, who does enter politics enthusiastically? The people still in the cave. The people who are fluent in shadow language. The people who can manipulate the images on the wall precisely because they've never questioned whether the images represent reality. These become our leaders, not because they understand reality better, but because they're better at manipulating the perception of reality. Not because they're wiser, but because they're more confident in their ignorance. Plato believed this was the central tragedy of political life. The guardians in his ideal republic, the philosopher kings, would rule only out of duty. They would see leadership as a burden, a sacrifice they make for the good of society. They would count the days until they could return to philosophy. Compare this to actual politicians throughout history. How many of them seem burdened by power? How many can't wait to give it up? Most cling to it desperately, fight to extend it, spend their entire lives accumulating more of it. This reveals something about their motivation. They want power for its own sake, or for what it brings them personally, not because they feel duty-bound to serve. And this selfish motivation, Plato argued, is precisely what disqualifies them. But you might object, isn't this elitist? Isn't Plato just saying that smart people should rule and everyone else should obey? That's how many people read him, but they're missing something crucial. Plato wasn't arguing that intelligent people should rule. Intelligence and wisdom are not the same thing. Plenty of intelligent people are fools. Plenty of clever people use their cleverness for manipulation and self-interest. What Plato meant by philosopher was something specific. Someone who had undergone decades of rigorous training. Someone who had studied mathematics to understand pure reason. Someone who had studied ethics to understand justice. Someone who had practiced dialectic to understand how to think clearly. Someone who had examined their own soul ruthlessly to understand their own biases and limitations. Most importantly, someone who had learned to love truth more than they loved power, status, or wealth. This kind of wisdom isn't about raw intelligence. It's about character development. It's about training yourself to see past your own ego, to question your own assumptions, to recognize how little you actually know. And here's the key. Once you've done this work, once you've genuinely achieved this kind of self-awareness, you don't want to rule anymore. You've transcended the appetite for power. Modern psychology has confirmed aspects of what Plato understood intuitively. Research on the Dunning-Kruger effect shows that people with limited knowledge dramatically overestimate their competence, while genuine experts, aware of the vastness of what they don't know, tend to underestimate theirs. Studies on narcissistic personality traits show that narcissists are more likely to seek leadership positions and more likely to be initially perceived as effective leaders by others. Research on confidence and leadership emergence demonstrates that groups consistently choose the most confident member as their leader, regardless of whether that confidence is justified by actual competence. All of this validates Plato's core insight. The psychological traits that make you seek power are not the traits that make you good at wielding it. So what did Plato propose as a solution? His answer in the Republic was radical and, frankly, impractical. He imagined a society where children would be identified early for philosophical aptitude, then put through decades of rigorous education. Mathematics, music, gymnastics, dialectic. Only after this training, and only after proving their character, would they be given minor administrative duties. More testing, more education. Finally, around age 50, if they had proven themselves wise and incorruptible, they would be compelled to take turns ruling. Not forever, just for a period, then back to philosophy. They would live simply, no private property, no families that might corrupt their judgment with nepotism. They would rule as a duty, not a privilege. Obviously, this system was never implemented and probably couldn't be. Plato himself seems to have known this. The Republic reads less like a practical blueprint and more like a thought experiment. If we really wanted the best people to rule, what would that society look like? And his answer reveals just how far we are from that ideal. But here's what makes Plato's vision so haunting. He wasn't just describing an impossible utopia, he was holding up a mirror to show us how broken our actual systems are. Every element of his ideal republic exists specifically to counteract a problem he saw in real political life. The lengthy education because real leaders are chosen for charisma, not knowledge. The communal living because real leaders use their position to enrich themselves and their families. The compulsion to rule because real leaders lust after power for its own sake. The rotation of duties because real leaders cling to authority and refuse to let go. When you read the Republic this way, it becomes less about what should be and more about what's wrong with what actually is. Plato is saying, look at how completely backward our selection process is. We choose leaders based on the exact opposite criteria from what would actually produce good governance, and we do it so consistently, so reliably across every society that it seems to be baked into human political organisation itself. This is the true tragedy. It's not that we occasionally get bad leaders, it's that our systems are designed almost perfectly to ensure bad leaders rise to the top. But even if Plato's specific solution is impractical, his diagnosis remains devastatingly accurate. We still face the same problem he identified. The people who seek power are generally not the people who should have it. The people who should have it generally don't want it. So what can we do? How do we escape this trap? First, we can design systems that select for wisdom rather than just ambition. This means creating barriers to power that require demonstrated competence. Singapore's model involves rigorous civil service examinations and long apprenticeships before anyone reaches high office. Germany's corporate governance separates management from oversight, preventing any single ambitious person from dominating. These aren't perfect systems, but they add friction that slows down the purely ambitious while rewarding those who prove themselves through competence. Second, we can change how we evaluate leaders. Instead of being swayed by confidence and charisma, we can demand evidence of actual expertise. We can be suspicious of people who claim to have all the answers. We can value leaders who admit uncertainty, who change their minds when presented with evidence, who surround themselves with people smarter than they are. Third, we can cultivate wisdom in ourselves. Plato believed philosophy wasn't just for potential rulers, it was for everyone. By training ourselves to think clearly, to question our assumptions, to recognize our own ignorance, we become better at evaluating leaders. We become harder to manipulate with simple slogans and emotional appeals. We start recognizing the difference between someone who understands complexity and someone who's just confident in their ignorance. Fourth, we can create accountability structures that expose incompetence. When leaders face genuine consequences for failure, when their decisions are transparently evaluated, when they can't hide behind complexity or shift blame, the incompetent get filtered out faster. The surgeon whose patients die loses their license. The engineer whose bridges collapse faces consequences. We need similar accountability for political and corporate leaders. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we need to recognize that Plato's paradox still operates today. When you see someone desperately fighting for power, ask yourself why. What kind of person needs power that badly? What hole are they trying to fill? Conversely, when you see someone reluctant to lead, someone who has to be persuaded to take responsibility, someone who sees leadership as a burden rather than a prize, pay attention. That might be exactly the kind of person who should be leading. Plato knew that good people make terrible leaders not because they lack ability, but because the process of becoming truly good makes you unwilling to fight for power. The ambitious rise while the wise withdraw. The narcissist campaigns while the philosopher hesitates. This isn't a bug in human nature, it's a fundamental feature. And until we design systems that account for this paradox, that actively seek out the reluctant and qualified, rather than just elevating the ambitious and confident, we'll continue to be ruled by people who want power far more than they deserve it. The question isn't whether Plato was right about this. History has proven him right again and again. The question is whether we're wise enough to do anything about it. Or will we continue living in the cave, arguing about shadows, while the genuine sunlight of wisdom remains outside, ignored by those who claim to lead us? Understanding this paradox won't solve all our leadership problems, but it's a start. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you recognize the pattern, you start noticing it everywhere. And maybe, just maybe, that recognition is the first step toward creating systems where wisdom actually matters more than ambition, where good people no longer make terrible leaders because we've finally figured out how to select them properly. Until next time, ask yourself, who in your life seeks power and who avoids it, and which of those people would you actually trust with authority over others? Plato knew the answer 24 centuries ago. The question is, do we?